Have you ever found yourself in a discussion where even after saying everything you needed to, you walked away feeling like you lost? Have you ever felt that knot in your throat, as if every word spoken had pushed you further away from your own strength? Perhaps you're surrounded by people who speak loudly, interrupt, mock, and dominate environments with arrogance disguised as confidence. And maybe deep down you believe that staying silent was a sign of weakness, that not defending yourself was surrendering, that not reacting was losing. But what if I told you that all of this is an illusion? That true power has never been in words but in their absence. Nietzsche, one of the most misunderstood thinkers in history, saw something that few have the courage to admit. Those who talk too much reveal too much. Those who need to convince are already at a disadvantage. The world teaches us that we must fight, explain ourselves, defend our ideas as if every conversation were a battle for the truth. But Nietzsche proposes something different, a more subtle, more lethal, and infinitely more intelligent path. He believed that silence is not just an absence of noise, but an overwhelming presence. Silence disconcerts, it destabilizes, it forces the other to confront themselves. This video is for you who constantly feels ignored, overshadowed, invalidated. For you who leaves conversations with the feeling that no one really heard what you meant to say. For you who is tired of being the easy target, the nice one, the one who tries to keep the peace while others take advantage of your calm. Why do we feel such a need to respond, to rebut, to correct, to prove that we are right? Because deep down we have been conditioned to believe that the truth must be defended, tooth and nail. That if we remain silent, we are allowing others to win. But Nietzsche saw this as a symptom of our deepest weakness, the fear of appearing weak. And behind this fear lies the ego, a fragile ego that cannot stand being questioned, that confuses disagreement with attack, and that turns any conversation into a battlefield. Nietzsche said that most people do not seek the truth when they argue. They seek power. They seek to reaffirm their beliefs not because they are solid, but because if they are shaken, everything crumbles. Argumentation in this sense is not a tool of wisdom. It is a defensive armor, a desperate cry from the ego to maintain control of the narrative. And what does this mean? That when you feel compelled to justify yourself to prove your point, you have already entered their game and lost. Because the simple need to justify your position shows that you are still trapped in the desire to be accepted, validated, understood. Nietzsche called this herd morality, the behavior of those who live under the expectations of others, who want to be seen as good, correct, just. But this quest for approval is exactly what keeps you weak. True strength, Nietzsche said, lies not in convincing others but in not needing to do so. It is in holding your vision even in the face of laughter, criticism, rejection. It is in being misunderstood and remaining unshaken. Meet Victor, a 38-year-old corporate strategist who has spent his career believing that the loudest voice in the room wins. Victor has always been the verbal combatant in meetings, the one who argues every point, who needs to have the last word, who leaves no criticism unanswered. He's built a reputation as someone you don't challenge unless you're prepared for a lengthy debate. But Victor's constant need to verbally dominate has come at a cost. His relationships are transactional rather than genuine. His colleagues respect his intellect, but avoid personal connection. And he's exhausted from the constant mental warfare of always needing to be right. Victor's turning point came during a crucial board meeting where he spent 20 minutes brilliantly defending his strategy against a competitor's quiet objections. He won the argument through sheer verbal force, but lost the contract. The client later explained they chose the competitor not because of superior ideas, but because of his calm certainty, his ability to present once and then simply wait with confidence, while Victor's desperate need to over-explain suggested underlying doubt. That night, Victor discovered Nietzsche's writings on power and silence, and something shifted. He realized that his verbal aggression was actually a symptom of weakness, not strength. His need to constantly justify himself revealed that he was still living according to what Nietzsche called slave morality, seeking approval and validation from the herd. Victor decided to experiment with strategic silence, and what he discovered would transform not just his career but his entire understanding of power. Nietzsche did not write for the weak. He wrote for the few who have the courage to look within, confront their own misery, and transform it into strength. For him, the common human leaves trapped by conventions, moralism, and the need for others' applause. But there exists another type of being, rare, dangerous, free. The Übermensch, or Overman, does not live by reacting to the world. He shapes the world in his own image. And the most impressive part, he often does this in complete silence. The Übermensch does not need to win debates. He does not engage in cheap emotional games. He observes, he understands, he carefully chooses when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent, because he has understood something that others ignore. Silence is a form of language, a language that does not try to convince. It imposes presence. The silence of the Übermensch is not empty. It is a threat. It is authority. It is the sound of self-mastery. While others shout, he commands respect with his gaze. While others explain, he observes and reveals others' weaknesses merely with his calm. His silence is a wall. Those on the other side despair, trying to guess what lies behind it. And in that despair, they make mistakes. They reveal too much. They lose their balance. This silence is not passivity. It is absolute control of one's own energy. It is strategic economy. The Übermensch knows that every spoken word is a revealed move. Every emotional reaction is an exposure of a weak point. That is why he remains quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because he does not need to say anything. Silence is not just the absence of sound. It is a mirror, and what it reflects for many is unbearable. When you choose not to react, you are not just silencing yourself. You are forcing the other person to hear their own voice, to confront their own arguments, without the comfort of external resistance. And that destabilizes because most people do not speak to express themselves. They speak to protect themselves, to convince themselves, to hide the emptiness that exists between what they say and who they are. And then when you remain silent, their disguise falls away. Social psychology has already shown that in confrontational situations, silence is perceived as judgment. It doesn't matter if you are just listening. The speaker begins to feel exposed, insecure. Why? Because without your response, without your reaction, they lose control of the narrative. The human brain goes into a state of alert. The amygdala, the region of fear and anxiety, activates. The other person starts to project their own fears onto you. Is he judging me? Did he notice my insecurity? Does he know I'm bluffing? And in this psychological battlefield, silence acts like an invisible blade. It cuts where no one sees, but everyone feels. Nietzsche sensed this long before modern psychology confirmed it. For him, the average person lives as a slave to their reaction. They act on impulse, react out of vanity, speak out of fear of being forgotten. The superior spirit, the one who masters themselves, remains silent because they know that every word given is a piece handed to the enemy. Every emotional reaction is an involuntary scream that reveals where to attack. Victor's first experiment with strategic silence came during a contentious meeting about budget allocations. Normally, he would have launched into an aggressive defense of his department's needs, overwhelming objections with data and rhetoric. Instead, he presented his position once, clearly and concisely, then sat back and simply observed. The silence that followed his brief statement was excruciating for him. Every instinct screamed to fill it, to elaborate, to defend. But he held firm. Something remarkable happened. His silence created a vacuum that others felt compelled to fill. Colleagues who would normally remain passive began speaking up, some defending his position, others revealing their own agendas and insecurities through increasingly desperate arguments. Victor watched the power dynamics shift as people scrambled to interpret his silence. Was it confidence? Indifference? Strategic calculation? The ambiguity made him unpredictable, and therefore powerful. When he finally spoke again, it was a single sentence that reframed the entire discussion. His words carried weight precisely because he'd proven he didn't need to use them. Nietzsche had written that the will to power is fundamentally about self-overcoming, not dominating others. Victor realized that his greatest act of power was overcoming his own compulsive need to verbally dominate. Each time he chose silence over reaction, he was practicing what Nietzsche called becoming who you are, shedding the herd mentality that equated talking with strength, and embracing a more profound form of authority. I want you to pause and examine your own relationship with verbal defense. How often do you find yourself over-explaining, as if your initial statement wasn't enough? How many times do you respond to criticism not because it's valid, but because silence feels like admission of defeat? Here's a revealing exercise. Recall the last time you won an argument through verbal force. Did you actually change anyone's mind, or did you simply exhaust them into submission? Nietzsche understood that the person who needs to explain themselves repeatedly reveals their own doubt. Confidence requires no justification. The Übermensch doesn't prove his worth through words, he demonstrates it through action and presence. Consider this. Who in your life gets most upset when you don't immediately respond to their provocations or accusations? Those people often reveal the most about power dynamics. They've become dependent on your reactions to validate their own position. Share in the comments one situation where you typically feel compelled to defend yourself verbally, not to judge yourself, but to begin recognizing patterns that Nietzsche would identify as slave morality, the belief that you must justify your existence and choices to the herd. Sometimes the first step toward authentic power is recognizing where we've been performing strength rather than embodying it. The time has come to stop merely understanding the power of silence and start using it. Because knowledge without practice is just dead theory. From now on, you will learn to transform your silence into a precision weapon, no longer as a defensive shield, but as a sharp blade ready to cut through others' masks at the exact moment they least expect it. And the first step is simple yet brutal. Be silent when your will screams for a response. This requires strength because everything in you will want to react, to justify itself, to prove that it is right. But that desire is poison. Every time you give into it, you reveal that you are still under the control of others, that you still care about what they think, that you are still playing their game. True silence is born only when you kill that need, when you understand that you owe nothing to anyone, that the truth does not need to be spoken to exist. The second weapon of silence is observation. While others talk, get lost in explanations, and try to fill the void with words, you listen, but you don't listen as someone waiting for their turn to speak. You listen like a hunter listens to the footsteps of prey in the forest. You perceive the fears hidden between the lines, the subtle contradictions, the insecurities disguised as arrogance, and you store all of this because when you speak, if you speak, it will be surgical. It will be with the precision of someone who masters the emotional territory of the other. The third weapon, time. Learn to let silence last. The pause is an element of tension, and tension is power. While the other person speaks, waiting for your reaction, and it doesn't come, they experience an internal collapse. But this brings us to an essential distinction, and one that Nietzsche himself grappled with. There is a difference between the silence of power and the silence of submission. Is there anything more perverse than being silenced? It is being conditioned to think that silence is your only option, that swallowing your anger, conceding in discussions, avoiding conflict at all costs, is synonymous with maturity, that remaining silent is a sign of balance. But what if I told you that this could be a trap? That many times this type of silence is not wisdom. It is disguised submission, Nietzsche saw this with brutal clarity. What you call peace is often just your domesticated surrender. Have you noticed how some people take advantage of your calmness, your ability to listen, to overlook, to avoid confrontation? They push their ideas, impose their wills, occupy spaces that were yours, and you convince yourself that it's not worth fighting, that it's better to maintain harmony, that it's not that big of a deal. But the truth is, you are paying a very high price for this false peace. And the worst part, you are being used by those who understand that you will never react. Nietzsche spoke of slave morality, that value system constructed by the weak to survive in a world dominated by the strong. It is the morality of resignation, of guilt, of being nice, an invisible code that teaches you to nullify yourself, to diminish yourself, to conform and still feel virtuous for it. The silence of submission needs to die, and in its place, the silence of presence must be born. Victor's complete transformation came during a hostile takeover attempt of his company. The aggressor's legal team was known for psychological warfare, intimidation tactics, aggressive rhetoric, marathon negotiating sessions designed to break opponents down. Victor's CEO wanted him to lead the defense, expecting the verbal warrior he'd always been. Instead, Victor did something that initially terrified everyone on his team. He adopted a strategy of minimal response. When the opposing counsel launched into aggressive attacks, Victor would simply listen, taking notes, his face impassive. When they finished, he would either say nothing, letting the silence stretch until they felt compelled to fill it themselves, or respond with a single clarifying question that exposed the weakness in their position. Hours into negotiations that typically took days, the opposing team began to crack. They couldn't read Victor, couldn't predict him, couldn't manipulate him through his reactions because he gave them nothing to work with. His silence forced them to argue with themselves, to reveal their actual positions, to exhaust their strategies against an opponent who wouldn't engage on their terms. The takeover attempt collapsed, not because Victor out-argued them, but because he refused to be drawn into verbal combat. He had embodied what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. He had conquered his own need to prove, to defend, to justify. In doing so, he became truly formidable, not despite his silence, but because of it. But I must give you a warning, because this knowledge is dangerous if misapplied. Nietzsche's philosophy is not a license for antisocial behavior, manipulative silence, or emotional abuse through stonewalling. The silence we're discussing requires profound self-awareness and ethical grounding. It is not about withholding communication to punish or control others. It is about freeing yourself from compulsive reactivity. Strategic silence is not the same as the silent treatment in relationships, which is a form of emotional manipulation. It's not about refusing to communicate when communication is genuinely needed. It's about discerning when speaking serves truth and when it merely serves ego. Nietzsche's Übermensch was meant to transcend conventional morality, not to discard all ethics and become a tyrant. The goal is self-mastery, not domination of others. You use silence to maintain your own center, not to destabilize others for sport. Consider the people in your life who genuinely deserve honest communication. Your partner, who needs to understand your feelings, your children who need your guidance, your true friends who've earned authentic engagement. Strategic silence is primarily for public interactions, professional negotiations, and relationships where power dynamics are already in play. With those you truly care about, the goal isn't to outsmart them, but to connect authentically. The Übermensch's power comes from the freedom to choose when and how to engage, not from a compulsive need to always withhold. Master the silence, but also master knowing when to break it with purposeful, authentic speech. We have reached the final point, and now I need you to understand one thing, with all the clarity possible. Silence is not absence. It is not emptiness. It is not a space between sentences. True silence is pure presence. It is mastery. It is the sign that you are no longer reacting to the world, but shaping it with your mere existence. Nietzsche never wrote for those who are content to survive. He wrote for those who want to transcend, for those who are willing to tear off the masks that society imposed, even if it hurts. The silence of the Übermensch is not the silence of the oppressed, nor of the coward. It is the silence of the warrior who has already won even before the battle begins. It is the stillness of one who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone because he knows who he is, and more importantly, he knows what he deserves. Now look at your life. How many times have you remained silent out of fear, out of guilt, out of not wanting to disturb? How many times have you let others decide for you, speak for you, trample over your truth? Nietzsche would say that living this way is an offense to existence itself, that accepting this kind of silence is betraying yourself. From today on, your silence needs to change its tone. It needs to stop being an escape and become an invisible shout of authority, a boundary, an affirmation of who you are, even if no one understands. Comment below, I choose the silence that commands respect, not just so I know you made it this far, but so you can publicly affirm this choice, this commitment to yourself. Because words have power, even when they speak about silence. And remember, the weak shout, the strong remain silent, the wise choose when.